I'm so excited to be here with modern monetary theory expert Patricia Pino. Hi, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
She is a research fellow at the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. She is an expert on modern monetary theory, or MMT, and she's a co-host of the MMT Podcast. Patricia, is there anything you can add, an introduction for yourself?
Well, yeah, I don't know if I call myself an expert. I think it's the first time I've heard you say it. But yeah, I've been involved with the activist community of MMT for quite a few years now, disseminating understanding about MMT through the podcast and other means, and as well as obtaining a proper degree in economics in order to maybe go further than that.
Awesome. Well, I've been reading and listening to a lot of your work, and you communicate in a way that is very clear. So I appreciate you being here. So like I mentioned, I have some problems with the Democratic Party's policy, but they describe the US federal government as spending is the same way a household does. Like a household might get credit card debt, and that could be really, really problematic down the line. And even the hero of the Democratic Party in my lifetime, Barack Obama, has said some things that really misconstrue how the economy actually works. So according to modern monetary theory, MMT, the household model of thinking about the government spending is like my spending. That's wrong. Is that correct? That's wrong to think about it that way?
Well, I think most people have the understanding that you and I had in the past as well of the economy, which was very much linking an understanding based on our household finances, right? You and I and everybody who has a home, a family, all the households in the economy, they all have to earn money before they can spend it, or alternatively, they have to borrow money before they can spend it. You know, they have to create and make funds available before they can spend that money. So there's a very important distinction that MMT makes between households and the government, and the distinction is between currency users, the households, and the currency issuers, which is the government. So this applies to all the economies who issue their own currency, including the United States and the UK, and many countries in Europe, but not all countries in Europe, and many economies in the world. And basically, it means that unlike a household, the government doesn't have to, earn money or acquire money before it can spend it. It doesn't have to borrow money before it can spend it, because it is the currency issuer. And I think everybody has been taught, and it's kind of everywhere within the culture, books, TV, movies, newspapers, everywhere, that this parallel between the government and the household, which is actually quite limiting to our understanding of the economy and how things actually work.
Okay, yeah. Analogies are so necessary for understanding, so it makes sense why people think about that. But when you actually just look at how the money is spent, what the core of MMT is talking about is what I believe you've referred to as policy agnostic before, which means, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not saying we should do this, we value this. It's simply saying this is how the economy works. Is that right?
Yeah, so the MMT community likes to say that MMT is a description, and MMT is a description of the monetary system. So it basically tells you the mechanics of what happens when the government spends and what happens through taxation. And through that, we find that it can assert things that the government creates money every time that it spends, that the Parliament or Congress approves a policy, the money is created to spend in that policy. And every time the government taxes, then that taxation constitutes destroying money, which is very different to the analogy that we were talking about earlier. And so analogies are important, but they can also be quite destructive. So because MMT is just at its core is just talking about the mechanics of how things work. There is a distinction to be made in the sense that it doesn't tell you how it doesn't tell you how to operate the machine. It simply tells you how the machine works. So I like to make the analogy of saying, I can teach you how to drive a car. I can't tell you where to go with it.
Cool.
So a lot of people then who ask about the link between MMT and politics, and the truth is that MMT at its core is politically agnostic, as I said. However, because of the times that we live in right now, and particularly because the household analogy has been so pervasive in society, and so used by certain sections of society for political ends, such as restricting the imagination of the electorate when it comes to, provisioning, social provisioning, and public purpose, effectively, is very limiting of those kind of policies. So our understanding of how the core mechanics of the monetary system has inevitably a political implication, because it opens up a lot of possibilities in the economy that we had given for granted that weren't possible before. And there are many times when I read, very well-meaning economists, usually on the left, who want to tackle things like poverty, who want to tackle things like unemployment, who want to tackle things like the developing nations and how to bring them forward. And yet almost inevitably, one of the first assertions they will make is they will restrain themselves under this idea that, but the government doesn't have any money. So once they apply that, then you are pretty much eliminating quite a lot of options from your potential solutions. And then your solutions become less powerful, let's say.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So it seems like the core of MMT, like you say, policy agnostic, it's just the description. But many MMT economists, after learning how the economy does work, it leads them to some realizations that might be more policy recommendations based on how the economy actually works. Okay,
Yes.
Would you say is it fair to say that the MMT community, after the descriptive part, in general, they support a full employment economy? And if so, what does that mean?
I think that one of the main premises of MMT is that, we talk about the way that government spends and taxes. And then we ask the question, why? Why did the government started doing this in the first place? And a lot of anthropological studies have been done, or have been incorporated into this, and kind of historical analysis of what was the role of money in the first place, and it inevitably comes to this idea that governments started spending money and creating money for the sake of provisioning themselves with services. So mobilizing the economy was the main factor. So then when you understand things like that, you can see that taxes actually create the need for people to go out and earn money in order to be able to fulfill those taxes that are imposed to you by the central authority, which is government. And then the government, by issuing the only means whereby you can actually pay those taxes with, and dictating what you can exchange that money for. So, for example, if the government says you need to pay $100 of taxes a year, and let's just call it a flat rate, $100 of taxes a year, and then you say, well, if no dollars exist, if no dollars have been spent into existence, then where are you going to pay for it with? So what the government does is it then says, okay, and I'll give you $100 or $150 even, if you build me bridges, or if you build me houses, or if you maintain these roads for me, or if you work at at this many public services. So you then see that taxation is actually what creates the need for people to seek employment. So what we say is taxation creates unemployment, and the spending tackles the unemployment.
Oh, that's really interesting. That's a lot to wrap one's head around. But
I know that there are better analogies out there, but
no, that's really helpful. It's just when you've learned so much in the past about how things work and is wrong, you have to deconstruct that and reconstruct it in a different way. So I guess I'll ask this. In both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, there is something that has been done, which I believe is referred to as a buffer stock of unemployed people, which essentially says if everybody gets a job, if everybody's out there working, it's going to be terrible for the economy and prices are going to go skyrocketing. And that just didn't make sense to me. Just from a logical standpoint, it says, I think, if Americans are working and producing things, that seems to be good for the economy. Can you kind of talk about where this idea comes from, that unemployment is actually good, and maybe talk about what MMT says about this?
Well, it's quite surprising to me when economies worry about too much employment, because they always say that the thing that they want to get rid of is unemployment. But then when somebody gives them the solution to it, they say no. And I think I know what they might have been referring to. I didn't see that particular speech, but I think what they might have been referring to is this idea in mainstream economics, which is about the something called the NAIRU, or the natural rate of unemployment, which is just this theory that links inflation to unemployment. So the lower the unemployment levels, the higher the inflation rate. And at some point, if unemployment is too low, inflation just shoots up and spirals out of control. So they kind of, this is what the monetary authority, what they call the central bank usually, they will aim for when they adjust their interest rates. They talk about, what the natural rate, you want to keep the employment rate or unemployment rate as close to what they consider the natural rate of unemployment, as close to that as possible, but not bringing below that, because then you risk inflation. And it's a very mistaken view. It's the economy doesn't is a very there's a lot of errors that are done along the way to bring yourself to that, that very simplistic view of just unemployment creating inflation. There are a lot of different factors that cause inflation, some of which are good, some of which are bad. I think the idea of inflation being caused by low unemployment was brought up at the time when before the 1970s, when maybe unions were a little bit more powerful, and so low unemployment gave them bargaining power to increase their wages, and that might increase inflation. We don't live in that world anymore, and decades ago as well, we had very different monetary arrangements to what we have now. We had things like the gold standard and other factors to worry about. We don't live in that world anymore, and I think a lot of these ideas or these assumptions about how the economy works are taken over from that time. And it's like some economists have not realized that the world changed at a very fundamental level when the US left the gold standard in the 1970s. And so MMT basically questions that, and it goes at the heart of that.
Thank you. That helps a lot. And you bring up the dreaded I word, which is kind of circulating a little bit right now in the United States, inflation. And to the extent that people know what MMT is at all, and it's growing a lot right now, thank goodness, but a lot of people still don't know about it. They think about, the MMT people are about just printing unlimited money. And that's just not accurate. Whereas I see the focus of modern monetary theory, MMT, as an eye to inflation. It's government spending with an eye to inflation to make sure that we actually have the real resources and the food and houses to make sure that prices don't go up. Could you speak to a little bit about what MMT thinks about inflation and how to combat it?
Well, basically, as I said, there are many reasons to inflation. So the first thing that MMT is, I believe, acknowledge is that there's no one single reason, and that in itself separates us from the mainstream, because in the mainstream, of course, there's inflation is always a bad thing. It's always bad for everybody, and there's only one solution to inflation, and that's raising interest rates. It's again very simplistic. It ignores that inflation is a result of there's always some beneficiaries and some people who don't benefit, and depending on who is benefit, you may want to do something about it or not. We've had a few guests on our podcast talking specifically about the subject of inflation, and I hope I'm not, butchering what they've said. But some of the aspects were that, for example, during the pandemic and the lockdown that we had, many companies, travel agencies, and things like that were struggling businesses, and many of them went bankrupt indeed. And following the lockdown, as people started emerging and suddenly everybody wanted a holiday, a lot of those same companies started struggling with the demand, that surge in demand that they were seeing. And so they raised prices, because you raise prices in a way to ration, the availability of whatever service they're providing. And that, it creates a surge in prices, which it eventually they'll catch up, and eventually demand will, slow down, because obviously people were all booking at the same time. But in that case, for example, you can say that, if say the car rental industry, say car rentals are going up in price because people want more holidays, and then you factor that in as part of your inflation cost and say, well, that's bad, let's bring it down. Should we be bringing it down? Should we not simply allow these companies to maybe recoup some of the profits that they have lost for the last year and a half or so? Is it really damaging? Is it really a disadvantage to anybody else in the economy who may not want to go on holiday necessarily? So you really have to get a close eye on what is actually causing the problem and who is benefiting and who isn't, in order to know, whether you want to, whether it's temporary, whether whether you want to tackle it, and B, what the best way of doing so as well. Some inflation may be caused by bottlenecks in production, in which case, rising interest rates as well is not going to help you, but you might want to solve the specific problem that you're facing in an industry, maybe acquiring certain goods from elsewhere, or, it's just very complex, and it's
we don't want that, though. Americans want a really simple solution. We don't want nuance. We want to say spending bad.
Yeah. Sorry, there's an awful lot of work out there. So
it seems really complex, and the car industry example makes sense. Maybe it's not the end of the world if rental cars cost a little bit more right now, because there's that bottleneck. It simply has to do with the real resources. Mm-hmm. But I'd like to ask you about something a lot closer to home, and no pun intended, which is the rising cost of housing in the United States. And I live in Portland, and there's all sorts of unsheltered people around, and it's just a huge problem. Basically, everyone in the United States realizes cost of housing, it's going up, it's a huge problem. What we disagree about is the solution. And as someone who's critiquing the Democratic Party, I'm a bit frustrated of this narrative about all government spending, no matter what, being bad, because it seems, from my perspective, passes the logic test and actual description of the economy, is if you want housing prices to go down, someone's going to have to build houses, so there's more available. Is it that simple when it comes to housing, that we just need more resources? And can you speak to the role of resources in core inflation as well?
Well, the housing problem, I mean, I live in the UK. I don't know the specific circumstances in the US, but I live in London, and here house prices have been an issue for quite some time. And I think from what I've seen, it's a combination of factors. Houses are a very special type of commodity, because they are obviously essential for people. for all our activities, but also they have been commodified to the extent that, right now they're often treated as financial assets more than as homes. And I think we have to, that has been, and I know that to young people who maybe it has always been like that, there was a time when that wasn't the case. And that has been actually a slow progression of this kind of using houses almost as piggy banks by people that have a lot of money, and or to try, people aspiring to building housing empires just simply to get rent and not contribute in terms of work specifically in other ways. But anyway, so the demand issue, the supply issue is of course part of the equation in there. But it's not just that, because we've had the way that we have dealt with the economy, as we said, we have a one solution for either controlling inflation or promoting investment. The issue is that when you do that, when you kind of apply a blanket rule to promoting investment, most investment will tend to go to places that are already wealthy, or private investors will tend to invest in whatever place they are more likely to get a profit. And that's more usually in places where people already have jobs, they have disposable income. So inevitably that has caused a concentration of jobs in the city. And that has promoted the kind of almost quite insane growth of cities compared to countryside areas where some towns have been actually been neglected. So you have you have this disparity between really cheap housing that exists in remote areas, but also insanely expensive housing that exists in the areas where all the jobs have been concentrated for the last few decades. So that is also an issue. Of course, we can, we can attempt to fix all that with just simply more supply and building more houses and more houses. But I think there is something to say as well as to evening out the level of investment and make it more equal across regions and across areas.
So maybe the answer isn't just build, but build smart, build in the right places, because the free market approach to it is just going to continue the problem. We actually need some forethought into where we build in order to bring down those prices.
Or where the jobs are. Yeah.
Okay.
We need to think about where the jobs are.
Great. And my final question for you, Patricia, and thank you so much for being here, is do you have any book recommendations? Of course, I recommend your podcast, the MMT Podcast with Christian Riley, but do you have any book recommendations for us?
Well, you've got some of the best writers in the US, Stephanie Kelton's book, Pavlina Cherneva's, her job guarantee proposal book is very good, and as well as accessible as Stephanie Kelton's book is on the deficit myth. I mean, those are quite good for people who are just becoming aware of MMT or just becoming aware of the job guarantee. There are, of course, the works of Warren Mosler's 7 Deadly Sins. It's also a very good introduction. And then for anybody who wants anything more advanced, by Bill Mitchell as well, who is Australian in this case. And again, there are many academics I could name from the US.
Great. And a lot of them are actually on your podcast. So if people are interested, they can go on your podcast and hear a lot of those interviews. And we'll link to that in the show notes and everything. Patricia Pino, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
All right.